Before we go, make sure you support the channel by subscribe. We're a meat family, my dad would proudly tell strangers. He'd wait for the quizzical look, then launch into detail, starting with how many freezers we had, how long we could sustain ourselves on the contents. It was just his way of starting a conversation, which made sense when you considered that raising and home-killing animals for food was, for want of a better term, his lifelong hobby. His prized possession was one of those industrial-sized vacuum sealers. You could put half a pig inside and wrap it in plastic so tightly that every wrinkle and skin fold waxed unreal with shiny detail. If we hadn't lived in a rural area, albeit semi-urbanized, I guess it would have been pretty weird. But the mostly farming stock locals only found his extra enthusiasm a little bit odd. When he wasn't being a bit embarrassing talking about it, I never really paid much heed to his hobby. I had a child's vaguely grateful awareness that though our family went through some lean financial times, our stomachs never suffered like some of the families around us. All the beef, pork, ham, and bacon in those big old chest freezers, passed down from his dad, really could have fed us for years. I should preface all this by saying that I wasn't a particular bright kid, though neither was I dumb. I didn't fail badly at anything in school, I just never achieved beyond a pass. I didn't know it yet back then, still quietly dreaming about being a ballet star or a dressage champion, but mediocrity was my destiny. And I think that's why I got on so well with my Aunt Liz. Liz was my dad's loving youngest sister. She was one of those women who get described as bubbly. Not really pretty, not really smart. Not a lot going on besides just being, well, all Liz. But she was salt of the earth, kind, caring, and great with kids. She was the only person who would willingly mind my two older brothers, who fought like hellcats and caused more trouble than the whole last generation of my family combined. People would privately lament to my parents that it was a shame Liz didn't have kids of her own. But Dad would just shake his head and say Liz liked it that way. That all the fun of looking after kids is being able to give them back to their parents. I guess she was like me. Nice but mediocre. Lovely but somehow forgettable when she wasn't doing something for you. But when Liz left us, I couldn't forget her. In hindsight, it was pretty weird timing that we had a big 40th birthday party for Liz right before she disappeared. She was radiant that night. She'd hired a local girl to do her hair and makeup, and it was honestly the first time I'd ever seen her look pretty. She'd even worn a push-up bra under a tight red dress, which flattered her very plump curves, well enough that the neighbor's farmhand was spotted disappearing into the wool shed with her for a snog. In my dawning awareness, that gave a plain girl hope. If Auntie Liz could get a guy at 40, maybe things would turn out okay for me. Anyway, I couldn't forget how her pink cheeks, her eyes, her whole self glowed that night before Liz went to bed. She said it was the best birthday ever, and that she was very much looking forward to the next stage of her life. Would I have done anything different if I'd known? If I had realized what exactly that next stage was? The week after the party, Aunt Liz said she was going on a little holiday up north to visit some old school friends. She packed her things, she didn't honestly have that many, and drove her little orange Mini out onto the main road. And with a wave of one fleshy hand, she was gone. Nobody really thought much of it when she didn't call, because nobody rural had cell phones back then. And Liz was, as I said, somehow kind of forgettable when she wasn't right in front of you. When we hadn't had contact for 6 weeks, Dad tracked down the landline numbers for their old school buddies. A surprise to hear from him. Liz had never arrived, so they had just assumed she'd canceled her visit. No one had thought to check. I eavesdropped on the conversation, and it sounded for all the world like they had forgotten about Aunt Liz too. From there, it became a missing person case. The local cops came and talked to all of us. The farmhand who'd been seen snogging her was briefly detained, then let go dead grilled at length. Even my Hellion brothers were questioned thoroughly to see if this was one of their wild and dangerous pranks gone wrong. But everything was a dead end. Nobody knew where Liz was or what had happened to her. The remains of her old Mini were found halfway across the country, burned out on a beach, on a derelict stretch of ragged, rocky coastline. The police assumed murder in Combe area for remains. But even the most expert device couldn't conquer the incredible undertow and fast-shifting seabed of that coastline to look for evidence, so none was forthcoming. Eventually, the cops collectively shrugged and said that there was really nothing more they could do unless more information suddenly came to light. The locals knew nothing, no witnesses had come forward, and the trail was cold. As far as anyone knew, poor Aunt Liz had been murdered on some desolate beach, far away from her home. It didn't feel fair to me. She'd once mentioned wanting her remains buried on our farm, in the graveyard plot beside Grandma and Grandad. So in my grief, I went into a room to look for something of hers to bury beside them. Like I said, Liz didn't have many things. Her room was pretty Spartan, and her wardrobe was mostly sensible farm stuff. There was one exception. She, like me, did like to read, and she had a pretty good collection of well-thumbed books. I think it's the escapism even the most mediocre girl can lose herself in the plot of some trashy romance novel. I imagine there's still hope of being swept off her feet by that handsome stable boy, his inexplicable yearning for chubby plain girls. So I set myself the task of going through the books to find the right one to bury in the graveyard plot. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect, but some of them were racier than I was used to. I felt various parts of my body flushing and tingling as I read breathless prose about calloused hands touching the softest flesh of the protagonist. Okay. If I'm honest with myself, I might have got a little too invested in my project at that point. But that was also why I persisted going through her entire collection until I found the ragged paperback from 1970 entitled Tawny Sands. And inside that trashy cardboard romance cover, I discovered not the tale of Tawny Sands, but some carefully hand-cut, stitched-in pages. A handwritten story in my aunt's rounded penmanship. Memoirs of a Long Pig. I read her story twice in a row, utterly gripped. And Liz was no Stephen King. Heck, she wasn't even the Goosebumps guy, but her story was gripping and compelling, and I couldn't put it down. Even if I hadn't known her, I think that would have been true. The gist of it was that Liz, when she was 16, had discovered that our family had a very long history of eating what she described as long porks. It's an Antipodean term, anglicized from the Pacific Islands. Human meat. Like me, young Liz still had some hopes and dreams. In one of her many failed attempts to find a special talent, she'd taken up cooking as a hobby. Naturally, with our family's overabundance of meat, she'd scoured the freezers in the shed for ingredients. The racks of ribs and stacks of pork chops. Butcher paper wrappings all neatly labeled with the first letter of the name of the animal they came from. She found familiar meat from Rodney, one of the pigs that had been recently slaughtered, emblazoned with an R in her father's strong, blocky lettering. There were cutlets labeled Am for Mary from one of the lambs she had hand-reared, and Au for Ferdinand, the steer they'd killed the month before. But she couldn't explain the many curious parcels of meat on one side of the huge freezer, all labeled AJS. And long till she took it all out and assembled it as well as she could on the scoured concrete floor of the killing shed. A big frozen jigsaw puzzle without the box. Her best attempt to discover what kind of beast the pieces had come from. The animal, she quickly realized, was a long pig. Her own Aunt Jenny, who had died the month before, just after her 40th birthday. Fortunately, or perhaps not, for Liz, her father entered the shed right at that moment and realized his daughter had discovered the family secret. He sat down calmly on the lid of the freezer and explained to her that this was a long-running family tradition, dating back to at least before his grandfather had been born. There are always people in life, Liz, he'd said, who won't really amount to much. They want to be useful, want to be more. They strive and they strive, trying job after job, hobby after hobby, trying to hit on something they're really good at. Something that makes them special. Those people can waste their whole lives chasing dreams that never come true. Eventually they die, being fulfilled, knowing that all their time has been wasted. That what they leave behind will fade quickly. His voice was oddly gentle as he leaned down and patted one of the neatly wrapped cuts of Aunt Jenny, still sitting frozen on the shed floor. Your Aunt Jenny was one of those people. So was my Aunt Ireton. He paused to gaze at his daughter, his next words peppered with emphasis. But you see, my sweet Liz, they did find a purpose in life. They did find a way to be special, and they left this world utterly certain of their gift. He stood up, stretched his back. Let me show you. Liz waited while my granddad meticulously stacked the meat back into the freezer. All but one J-marked parcel that looked for all the world like a thick venison steak. He took her back to the farmhouse and reverently unwrapped the deep red, heavily marbled meat to let it thaw. Then he laid it in the family's ancient cast-iron pan, basting it with butter and rosemary until a heavenly scent filled the kitchen and Aunt Liz couldn't stop her mouth from watering. Just try it. Let her show you. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Even though she knew it was her aunt, Liz couldn't stop herself from taking that first bite. There was something transcendent about the smell, overriding her natural revulsion that this was human meat, not one of their farm animals. For the first time, she truly realized it. We're just another kind of animal. And weren't her memories of Mary the lamb almost as fond as her memories of Aunt Jenny? Liz explained, and in her curly handwriting, the explosion of taste that assaulted her when she tried the steak. It was tender, it was succulent, it was rich beyond imagining. The fats melted on her tongue, lingering somewhere between pork and beef, but oddly neither. The flavor of the meat defied identification, something familiar yet not. But one thing she couldn't deny. It was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. Tears dripped onto her plate, mingled with the juice. The grease, not grief, but a pure, real, giddy delight. You're tasting your aunt's love for this family, my granddad explained. Her entire life was carefully curated to eventually make unforgettable moments for us just like this. This was her way of being special. This was the greatest gift she could possibly bring to our world. And because she realized that, she died with not a single regret. She knew her life had purpose. She was perfectly, completely fulfilled. I felt those words. I felt them lodge in my own belly, settling uncomfortably deep. I knew Aunt Liz probably better than anyone else in the family. I'd seen how fucking happy she'd been on her 40th, how goddamn fulfilled she was despite apparently being a nobody and achieving nothing. Somehow, in the space of a single day, she had gone from being a forgettable background character to becoming the main character, immortalizing herself in our family's history with her sacrifice. Quite literally becoming part of all of us forever.